How's it going, everyone? And welcome in for a early week edition of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. A lot to get into throughout the course of the weekend. The standings are starting to look a lot more normal for the WCC. With that said, is St. Mary's back? We'll get into that a little bit. Oregon State, big upcoming week for the Beavers, both Gonzaga and USF on the docket. But we're going to start with Santa Clara. And Santa Clara making some moves in the early part of WCC play. They had a week where they beat Oregon State 82-81 in overtime. Talked a lot and more in depth about that on Saturday. And then on Saturday, the Broncos got a big win against USF, 77-54, the final at the Levy Center. The Dons led this one 28-21 at the half. Really, Santa Clara did not look good at all in that opening period. They were down 7, but in the second half, they went on a 25-4 run that put them up 18. They led by as much as 20. 56 second half points for Santa Clara. Carlos Stewart Jr., scoreless in the first half, had 25 in that second period. Elijah Mahi, 17 points for the game. He had a really good week, 17 against USF and 21 against Oregon State. This was USF's largest margin of defeat, this 23-point loss. Santa Clara held them to 35% from the field, was plus 10 in rebounding. And a pair that really went off in the first game, Malik Thomas and Marcus Williams, who had 34 and 23 respectively in the first matchup, had 19 and 6 in this one. So a very different outcome in this one for USF, and then obviously for Santa Clara, as they just missed beating USF the first time around up in San Francisco. And this is a trending thing for Santa Clara right now. They have won 9 of their last 10 games. They are 4-1 in WCC play. They have 4 quad 1, quad 2 wins, tied for the most in the WCC with Gonzaga and Washington State. And this Santa Clara team looks like that they're starting to figure everything out. They're healthy. They're playing well against good teams right now. And I've talked a lot about the course of the season that this Santa Clara team has, of maybe the not after Gonzaga St. Mary's, has the highest ceiling. The talent is there. A lot went into the offseason of talking about how all the pieces are here for this team to make a tournament run. The schedule was there for them to make a tournament run. Now, they still have a very, very tough hill to climb. They're 66 in the net, which, again, is not a terrible position, but you are still a ways from being back into the quote conversation. But they've handled their business to this point. They win and got a win against Oregon State. They win and got a win against USF. They're going to have to do it. Obviously, they still need to see Gonzaga, still need to see St. Mary's, still need to see Washington State. And I think they're going to still have to do some serious damage against those teams as well if they're going to get back into the conversation. But I thought for a while that this is a team that could very well end up in third place. Even a couple weeks ago, I said, I still think that they're going to come out of this stretch out of WCC play as the third place team. That was my prediction. And so far, so good on my call on that one, as they've picked up 2 critical wins against some of those other teams that they're going to end up facing in these tough matchups. Now, for Santa Clara, thinking about what they've already done to this point, they're also handling their business against the teams they need to beat. Now, yes, the San Diego game was not a pretty one. They only won that game by 1 on the road. So there is still some concern. They're not playing great basketball, but what we saw on Saturday against the Dons was about as well as they have played all year long. And that second half really was just everything coming together for them. They played much more aggressive on defense. They're much more aggressive offensively. That team looked the part of a team that could be that is a tournament quality team, tournament level team. But as I mentioned, they still got a ways to go. They are now, I think, what is it? Overall, they are 12-6. So not too bad right now. Now, the challenge this week, they are going to be on the road for both games at LMU and at Gonzaga. And we'll get to Gonzaga obviously later in the week because this is a team that the Broncos did beat a year ago. So there is some recent history with Santa Clara playing the Zags well. And also, like, they played them well in Spokane a year ago. So it's not like Santa Clara is going into a scenario where they win one, but then completely don't show up for the second one. They played well in the second one as well. So this will be a fascinating matchup on Saturday. But before we get there, again, never try to overlook the first game before you play Gonzaga. Washington State kind of fell into that earlier in the week. But they have LMU. And yes, LMU's record is not great. They're 1-4 to start WCC play. They did have their game on Saturday postponed against Pepperdine for the obvious reasons of the wildfires still raging in that region. But this is a team that did beat OSU in Gersten Pavilion. This is a team that you really can't let get going because the pieces are there to pull upsets. Like, this is a very talented team. And a lot of the times, like, and I said it last week, this team will go as Will Johnston goes. We've seen, obviously, really good performances from Caleb Stone-Carrawell, from Javon Porter, from Alex Merkviladze. But this team, the tone setter, what really makes this engine go, and when LMU is playing their best, is when Will Johnston is playing his best. And so the matchup of him against the Santa Clara backcourt, likely Carlos Stewart is going to be the matchup there, is going to be critical in how this game starts to take shape and what this is going to look like. I do think that LMU, the fact that they did get an unexpected bye on Saturday is going to help in their favor. I think this is a scenario where you could see LMU play a little bit. They're going to be a little bit healthier. They're going to be a little bit have a little bit more energy as Santa Clara has come back-to-back games with some tough opponents. And this is a potential letdown game after those two. And then, of course, Gonzaga being on the horizon. So for me, like, the keys to this one is LMU getting into the rhythm early offensively. If that happens, they're going to be in this. If Santa Clara can prevent them from getting going early, that's going to bode well. The rebounding is also going to be critical. LMU is not that great of a rebounding team, and Santa Clara has done a better job on that front as of late. Again, plus 10 against USF, a decent rebounding team in and of themselves. And Santa Clara is a big team. This is an opportunity where Santa Clara can really take advantage of that. Really play, like, Tilly, I think, is going to be a huge component for Santa Clara on this one. If he can stay out of foul trouble and stay in this contest, he's going to be real. He's going to, I think, play really well. Cam Tung is also a guy who has obviously played really well over the last month as well. One of the things to watch, though, is that Brenton Napper is day-to-day. He did not play in the game against USF, and he has an ankle injury right now, but it is a little bit day-to-day. It's not a serious one, so we will see what happens come Thursday if he's going to be able to go, because that does change a little bit of the equation for Santa Clara when it comes to rotations and what the backup point guard starts to look like. We did see a little bit more of Elijah Mahi playing that role on Saturday in his absence. So something to watch. I think that's the key for this game. If LMU can get off offensively, this is going to be a good one. If Santa Clara can contain them early, I think Santa Clara could actually run away with this one down in LA. And we talked about Santa Clara, where they are, and the fact that they're playing well right now. They're progressing in the right direction as we've entered this first third of conference play. USF is trending in the other direction, and they have lost 2 of their last 3, the 2 being Washington State and Santa Clara. Obviously, like, these are 2 good opponents in the conference, and they have started to maybe show some signs of not necessarily fatigue, but it's like you can see that there's something missing right now. There's an edge that was missing in the second half against Santa Clara. They let Washington State get away from them in the second half again up there in Pullman. So there have been some concerns in the second half of both of those games where they've let teams get away from that. And they shot 6 for 32 from three. They have been a little, obviously, heavily reliant upon shooting the three well. We haven't seen great outings from Marcus Williams in either of those, and so that's another component to that. But I also think we're starting to see the long-term effects of not having Guido Newberry. I think we're starting to see this team show a little bit of the defensive cracks down low. Not to say that obviously we haven't seen good play from Barry Wong. We've seen it from Vinny Abosi. We've seen this defense will play well. Carlton Lingard Jr. as well. They're still playing well, but there's clearly something missing in these second halves that they're allowing teams to really get out offensively and just really put it on them. So this is a concern going into this week. 2 games. Both of them are critical for USF. One, they're going to be at Pepperdine on Thursday, assuming that there's going to be games in Malibu. So we'll see. That is a TBD as of right now. I'm still a little bit in question if those games are going to happen yet. But then they host Oregon State on Saturday, and that's another big game for both of those squads. Oregon State, we'll get into them in a little bit. Both of them Oregon State needs that game. USF needs that game. USF, that game the other night just really put a huge, not nail in the coffin, but it really hurt their chances of getting back into the at-large conversation. They slipped all the way to 76 in the net, and that is just, that was not a spot I thought I would see that USF squad in at this point. It really felt like that they were trending in the right direction as non-conference ended, and they've picked up some interesting bad results for this team. But we will see as they go through this week at Pepperdine and Oregon State. These are 2 games they need. The at Pepperdine one, again, you can't sleep on this Pepperdine team. They are good enough to steal some games. They are good enough to beat some of these better squads. We saw what Pepperdine was able to do against Gonzaga just a couple weeks ago. They're going to push teams. And in that building, with that team, and maybe with a little bit of emotion behind them right now, this is going to be a game that I think is going to end up being pretty good on Thursday. So Oregon State. This is a big, big week for the Beavers. And kind of go over the little bit of the resume. They're 59 in the net. They are overall 13-5. So the overall record looks good for them. But the problem is this quad 1, quad 2 scenario. They are 1-4 in those games. They do not have a quad 1 victory as of yet. But they have a quad 1 and a quad 2 opportunity this week. They'll be hosting Gonzaga on Thursday, and then they do travel to USF to take on the Dons on Saturday. So Thursday, probably the biggest game of the WCC calendar, Oregon State hosting Gonzaga. It is the first time in 34 years the 2 will meet. And both teams are coming off of big wins in various ways. Oregon State's coming off a win where they just clobbered Pacific, where they needed to kind of get back into a rhythm against a team that had already pulled an upset earlier in the week against Washington State. So that was kind of a cleansing win for them. They needed one of those on the road, their first road win of the season. So another kind of like feather in the cap for them. And for Gonzaga, they're coming off a big win against Washington State, where they pulled away in the second half of that contest. The Zags also are a team that's starting to look like they're hitting their stride. Their offense is starting to click a little bit more. I think this is maybe like we're seeing this offense look maybe about as good as we've seen it since the Baylor game, maybe going all the way back to opening night. They shot 67% in the second half of that game, 19-8 in second chance points. They did let Washington State shoot 53% for the game. So that's a little concerning. And the fact that, yes, you still won by double digits, but you allowed a team to shoot 53% in your own building. So if I'm going to qualify anything, there's that. Now, some of the positives for Gonzaga in that one is that you had Nolan Hickman kind of reemerge as a guy who's going to give you buckets and everything else. Like, he had a really good game in that one. Graham Ike continues to play his best basketball of the season. And I do think that that's where my things to watch starts in this game. It's Graham Ike, Braden Huff against this OSU front line, which is a more physical front line than what Gonzaga has seen to this point. Washington State isn't as physical of a front line. They're a little bit more, especially on the offensive end, rely on the three-point shot. This is not what that group's going to do for Oregon State. So I'm thinking about, like, if there's a comparison to what they've seen to this point, and the best one might be what we saw from UCLA earlier in the non-conference. But for me, it's like this still does lean Zag favored. Grant, again, Ike has continued to play well. Braden Huff, like, these two arguably could both end up being all WCC level players. Ben Gregg has played really well the last couple weeks since he's been reinserted into that starting lineup. It was almost kind of about this time last year where Gregg was put into the starting lineup, and we saw just how much different the Zags looked with him in there. So we're starting, I think, to see a little bit of that now with him, with a different unit. We had a 3-guard set with Gregg, with Ike, as the starting lineup for the Zags, and I think that that's going to actually be what we see moving forward. The other matchup, again, I mentioned Nolan Hickman, how he's played well. Nate Kings is one of those guys for Oregon State that I think is similar in the way to Hickman, that if they play well, this is a different squad. When Nate Kings shoots the 3 well and he gets out and Oregon State's able to kind of get him involved early, this Oregon State team can pull away from other squads. They look offensively like a different team. This is a guy who shoots nearly 50% from 3, so someone you have to keep an eye on. Someone Nolan Hickman is probably going to have to keep an eye on in this one. And again, flipped on that one is Hickman's kind of the same way. If he plays well, the Zags are hard to beat. They're hard to beat anyway, but if he's playing well, he plays like he did the other night, where there was an aggressiveness, there was a confidence. That's the sort of, when he does that, that's the best form of Nolan Hickman, and that's when the Zags are probably at their best, is when he, along with everybody else, is going. And for a lot of times, you talk about the Zags of how do you beat this team? How do you pull the upset against the Zags? And a lot of it, to me, comes down to pace. Because you can't out-Zag the Zags. If you try to play at their pace, if you try to play this up-tempo style, you will lose more times than not. And that's why I think for Oregon State, they are going to be best suited to try to slow this team down. If anything, it's like, I'm going to go all the way back to the North Texas game. If you want to try to beat the Zags, you have to try to play the style that you played against North Texas. You have to try to slow them down, drag them out. Kind of do against the way Oregon State played against North Texas, or the way St. Mary's plays them. Slow them down if you can. And that's going to, again, the Zags will still go on runs. They will still have those moments, even if you slow them down. But if you can dictate the pace, if you can control just the shot clock, if you control more of what they're doing, I think that will give you a better shot to kind of pull this upset against Gonzaga, a team that is going to push tempo, a team that has so many different weapons, and for a team that doesn't have as many weapons in Oregon State, what you're going to have to do all the little things right, rebound the ball well. I think you're going to have to contain the EK Huff combo, and if you do that, all those things, I think you stand a chance against Gonzaga. I don't like Oregon State in this game. Not the way the Zags have been playing the last week or so. To me, this still heavily favors Gonzaga. So, but we will see. Like, this is a critically important game for Oregon State. If you get this game, now we're starting to talk about potential at large for the Beavers, because they haven't lost their other games. You look at the rest of their schedule, they haven't done anything to say absolutely definitively they're not a tournament team. They just haven't done anything to tell you they are yet. And Thursday is an opportunity to show everybody that, yes, they do indeed belong in that conversation. Okay. So, obviously, as we're getting a little bit deeper in the WCC play, the standings are starting to look a little bit more familiar, as I mentioned early on. Top of the conference right now, both Gonzaga and St. Mary's are at 5-0. Big surprise. Santa Clara is sitting at 3rd and 4-1. USF in 4th at 4-2. Oregon State and Washington State sitting at 3-2. Then you start to get below to the lower tier of the league. Pepperdine 1-3, LMU 1-4, San Diego 1-4, Pacific 1-5, Portland 0-5. Not a huge surprise at this stage of where everyone is starting to line up. If there's anything that might be the little bit of a, not surprise, but how it's happened, is what St. Mary's has done with its first 5 games. Now, to the caveat that the 5 games that they have played have been against the bottom tier of the league. They played San Diego, they've played Pepperdine, they've played Portland, they've played LMU, and they've played Pacific. They've literally played each of the bottom 5 teams of the league. However, in those 5 games, they have not allowed a single one of them to score more than 60 points. They have, in that time, jumped up 17 spots in the net because they, one, are steamrolling teams, but then also have been starting to get help from some of the other opponents they played in the non-conference. Nebraska, USC, Utah are starting to pay some dividends for the Gales. The game against San Diego on Saturday, where they won 103-56. Yes, St. Mary's was the first WCC team in conference play to get to the century mark, which is a wild statement in and of itself, just because of the pace in which they play. But that pace probably gave them the edge on this number. This is from Jared Burson on X. St. Mary's scored 1.65 points per possession in a 103-56 road drubbing of San Diego. That's the highest points per possession by any Division I team in a road game over the last 18 seasons. And it is also the highest points per game in any game since 2021. So they have been incredibly efficient over the last week or so, or last couple of weeks. And yes, they're doing it against the bottom tier of the WCC, which should be expected. But even that, thinking about just the historical component of how good they were against San Diego, does speak to how well St. Mary's is playing overall. Because you can come into these games and just kind of sleepwalk through some of these contests, but St. Mary's didn't. Like, they looked like a well-oiled machine in this one. You got contributions from up and down the lineup here. And you look at their resume overall, it's starting to look like the St. Mary's team of a year ago. They're 15-3 overall, 5-0 WCC play. They're 33 in the net. They're 28 in KenPom. They are 3-3 in Quad 1 and Quad 2 games, including 2-0 in Quad 1, which is the same number of Quad 1 victories as Gonzaga. So looking at this, yes, they have beaten up on teams that they should beat up on. Fine. You have to handle your business in this conference, as everybody knows. Sometimes you hit some lulls, but St. Mary's has not had that lull in this stretch. However, after their game against Pepperdine on Saturday, again, all assuming that they do play this game, they will enter their toughest stretch of conference play, maybe arguably their toughest stretch of the season, when they have an 8-game stretch where they'll start with USF, they're at Washington State, at Santa Clara, Gonzaga, at USF, at Oregon State, back home for Santa Clara, and then back home for Washington State. A really running the gauntlet of St. Mary's have the bottom half of the league right now. Again, like also rounding out with Pepperdine early on in conference. Well, the next 8 are going to be the top half of the conference. And we are going to see what the St. Mary's team really is in this stretch. This is a stretch where, I mean, easily you could make the case that they could end up going 7-1, but I could also make the case where they might go 4-4 in this grouping. I think right now, like we're looking at a St. Mary's team that is starting to play its best basketball now. I think you're starting to see some of the roles solidify a little bit more, but I'm waiting to see them do it in this stretch. I need to see it against USF. I need to see it against Washington State. I need to see it against Gonzaga. I need to see it against these teams to show that, kind of validate what we have seen to this point. Even though, yes, like some of the early non-conference games are starting to kind of come back around and be more valuable, that Nebraska and USC games are starting to look really good for St. Mary's. But all that said, I need more. I need them to prove it. And the metrics, the numbers are starting to really heavily favor them. But you better pick up some of these wins. You go through that stretch, and let's say they go 6-2. Again, all of these games, I'm pretty sure, like quad 1, quad 2 games. You go 6-2 in that, and now you're 9-5 in quad 1 and quad 2 games. That looks really good on the resume. That is going to be a stretch where then you can say and stamp it, yes, we are indeed a tournament team again. We're going to be back in that conversation. Because honestly, like right now, it's like, I think St. Mary's is going to be the other WCC team in the tournament because everybody else has started to cannibalize each other as we thought they might. And it could end up costing the rest of them and a spot in the NCAA tournament. And now that, I mean, it could end up with 4 WCC teams in the NIT because of that. But it's really put the cannibalization has put a damper on the tournament hopes. But it's also, I think, to an extent, bolstered what each other have done and kind of almost solidified where they are in the net rankings, because now they're doing damage against just each other. And they're all kind of like packed in. I think it's all of them are somewhere between 59 and 76. So like that's where the rest of that group is. So that cannibalization isn't doing too much to kind of move all of their needles. So tough stretch for St. Mary's coming up, but that doesn't start again for another week. Oregon State, Gonzaga is obviously the big one on Thursday. So full slate for Thursday is Santa Clara at LMU, which is another one to keep an eye on. The Santa Clara needs to kind of keep this rolling if they're going to try to climb out the hole that they dug themselves in non-conference. Pacific at Portland, that'll be an interesting one to kind of see who's able to come out of that. Pacific obviously played well in one game last week and then played horribly in the other, so we'll see if they can pick it back up. Washington State at San Diego. This is one of those trap games. San Diego's can be a little bit one of those tougher teams for certain squads. We saw them give Santa Clara a run in their matchup last week or 2 weeks ago. San Francisco at Pepperdine. We'll see if that game actually does occur. And then, of course, Gonzaga at Oregon State as the nightcap on CBS Sports Net. The only game of the night that's not on ESPN+. All right, well, that'll do it for this episode of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. We will indeed be doing another Saturday morning live to cover all of the Saturday matchups from the WCC. So we'll talk a little bit about the Thursday games and what happened there, but then dive into what we're going to see on Saturday in the full slate of games there as well. All right, follow along on social at Post by Zach at unofficial WCC pod. And that'll do it. Thanks for hopping on, everybody, and I will catch you later.